In 2020, as COVID swept the world, the Australian's reporter Will Glasgow found himself in a difficult position. He was the Australian's China correspondent, but he wasn't able to get into China.
I left China in July 2020, back in the early-ish pandemic days, and I thought, just for a couple of weeks to go and get my wife, who was stuck back in Australia. She'd been stuck out of China because of its COVID travel ban, and thought I was just ducking back and then would come back with her through Chinese quarantine and then continue being the Australian's correspondent in Beijing. But the world had other ideas, and while we were back waiting for our visas, Chang Lei got detained, and then the other two corros here, Bill Birtles and Mike Smith, got hurried out by Chinese state security. And surprise, surprise, I was told not to board my plane back by the Australian government. And so now I'm based in Taipei.
Yeah, so there was a pretty real concern that you might be detained or other journalists could be. How did you feel about that at the time?
Oh, look, China in 2020 was all sorts of things, but it was an enormous story and I really wanted to be on the ground doing it. So, look, I was professionally frustrated, but look, personally, I was worried. And my wife thought I was insane to even think about coming back to China, to be honest. And it remains the case, actually. So much of what happened then's not clear and isn't known. And exactly how real the danger was for Bill and Mike and for me is not clear either. But a few years on, I don't begrudge the Australian government for taking a cautious approach on that.
By September 2020, all the correspondents for Australian media outlets were forced out of the country, fearing they could be detained or even imprisoned if they remained. It wasn't an unreasonable fear. Australian diplomats were telling reporters to get out as quickly as possible. Australian Chinese TV journalist Chang Lei had been arrested and subsequently served almost 3 years in a Chinese prison for breaking a government embargo by a couple of minutes. And in the background, China was venting its fury at Australia's criticisms over its secrecy about the origins of COVID-19. China slapped massive sanctions on Australian goods, banning our coal imports and applying huge tariffs to everything from barley to wine.
More than a week after threatening to impose 80% tariffs, China is following through with that threat, effectively wiping out a key $600 million export market. Now, Beijing...
Those sanctions are now being wound back, but it's been a challenging few years for the journalists who want to report what's going on for China and her 1.4 billion citizens. So what's it been like trying to cover China from afar? How does that work?
China's run by the Chinese Communist Party, a very closed political system, famously so. So whether you're here or there, you have to use a lot of the same tools. I mean, in some ways, some things are easier. You don't have all the internet dramas you have being based in China. I mean, just being back here just for a couple of days already, I'm tearing my hair out at how hard it is to get onto the internet outside of China. And so many of the apps that are just commonplace in my life as a reporter, they just don't work here. Or they only work with a VPN, which is really tricky. And it gets more tricky when there's a big political event on, like this political meeting I'm here for right now. So the internet coverage is just a nightmare. So some things are easier, but what you do miss, of course, is, seeing things with your own eyes and talking to people in China as they go about living their lives. Also, you miss just seeing a lot of the quirkiness of it. I find a lot of comedy in just getting around China, but also just a lot of sweetness as well, and just the human dimension of it. That gets carved out by not being based here, which is, I think, a great shame.
Will's in China for an important reason, the annual National People's Congress, a meeting of the top rulers of China's Communist Party government. The National People's Congress is technically China's parliament, with 3,000 deputies representing various sectors of the Chinese population, like agricultural workers and government employees working in the cities. But the Congress is a rubber stamp. There are no fiery debates or shrieking across the chamber like in our parliaments. There are votes, but they are largely ceremonial. Now, you've been granted a visa to come and cover this event. Why did China let you back in for this Congress?
Yeah, look, it's interesting. I tried to come to this last year and no luck. I put my application in and just nothing came of it. Now, I mean, There's still all sorts of trouble, but there's certain things that are different, and some of that tension they're trying to dial down. And I think as part of that whole big system-wide effort, journalists like me who haven't been able to get in almost entirely except for leader visits have been allowed in this time. I think it's part of just trying to re-engage with the world, or the leadership doing that. And frankly, a lot of it's driven by economics, right? A huge amount of international investment isn't coming into China in a way it was only a few years ago. And I think the leadership's very worried about that. And they want to tell a more positive story about the Chinese economy. And they think that the international media could be useful for that.
What's the central cause of that stagnation in the Chinese economy? Is it post-COVID fear from foreign investors?
That's one big driver. I mean, foreign investment's been a huge part of China's extraordinary economic growth in the last 40 years. Money's come in, and with that money, expertise has come in that has helped China do and make things better than it could, right? Some people think that some arrogance and hubris crept into the Chinese leadership. I mean, quite a few people think that, and that the leadership thought it could get by without that. It could do things itself. If people had that thought, they seem to have reassessed it a bit. They seem to realise that without that capital coming in, that really does crunch the Chinese private sector. I mean, the Trump era completely reset things in that way. And the risks for international businesses operating in China and having supply chains here for them, there's all sorts of sanctions concerns and other things that they have to think about today in terms of what Washington might do, and what, if they're operating in American ally economies, what kind of policy settings could impact them. They've got to think about things that they just weren't thinking about, if you go back to pre-2016 or really pre-2018. And then overlaid on that, you've got a big post-pandemic slump. Zero COVID was really brutal here in 2022, and the economy did really badly then. And it shook a lot of people's confidence in the government. People felt very good about the Chinese economy. When I left by mid-2020, people in China were thinking their government was on top of this in a way that almost no one else was, right? And as that year went on, they felt more and more that way. And it's the same going into the early 2021. That passed spectacularly in 2022. They didn't vaccinate their population with any kind of haste. They just kept tightening the COVID zero restrictions. And it meant just traveling and getting around and living your life in China became really difficult. And that did a lot of damage to people's confidence and really hurt a lot of businesses here. And they just still haven't had that much of a post-COVID rebound. It seems a lot of people's confidence in their government was shaken, and that's still to come back. So that's a big part of what the government's trying to do this week.
Coming up, why Australia is anxiously awaiting one particular speech at this Congress, and the much-missed Beijing delicacy Will has been desperate to taste again. While I've got you, we'd love you to get more of this journalism by subscribing to The Australian. Check us out at theaustralian.com.au, and we'll be back after this break. You'd never hear this from President Xi Jinping, but China is deeply concerned about the state of its economy. Foreign investment has dried up. Chinese consumers aren't spending. They're trying to save their money instead, which is always a signal of unease about the future. If you're worried about keeping your job or what might happen to your home, you're not likely to spend as much as if you're feeling happy and relaxed about the future of the economy. One of the main events of the Congress will be Chinese Premier Li Qiang reading something called a work report.
So it's read by the Chinese premier, and it's kind of the one occasion in Chinese elite politics where all the eyes aren't on Xi Jinping. So for about 40 minutes or however long the speech goes for, he gets to be the centre of attention. The key thing people look for in that, he will announce the growth target for China this year, and that's expected to be 5%. That's by China standards low. By other economies, you couldn't imagine it. There'll also be a whole bunch of other targets he sets in that, from grain production they plan to have in 2024 to the number of youth employment jobs they want to make, targets they have for how low to keep the unemployment rate, number of new rail tracks they're going to roll around the country, and on and on and on. It functions a bit like the budget does in the Australian political system, but, with Chinese characteristics. There's a speech and then they kick everyone out and close the doors.
The centrepiece of the work report will be China's growth target for this year. Analysts are expecting it to be about 5%. For context, that's pretty healthy growth for a country like Australia. It's nowhere near China's stratospheric growth rate pre-COVID, but it would mean the Chinese economy is really powering again. It would also be good for Australia.
China setting a growth target of 5% in this current environment means there'll be a lot of talk in this report about new industries and high innovation that the Chinese government's pursuing. And that stuff's very real. Their R&D spend is huge, and they really are trying to make sure they can do things the Americans can do and not be vulnerable to further tech sanctions and things. But a huge amount of that growth that they're going to try to do across the economy is going to be in old school, state-owned, state-backed, state-supported industries. And that benefits Australia immensely, right? The big thing is the steel industry, most of it full of Australian iron ore. And so to get to a 5% growth target in China, just the nature of its economy, in this current environment, it's going to be a lot of construction that's been done by the Chinese government and by Chinese state-owned enterprises, not the private sector. But look, that's not good for the margins of the Chinese steel producers. It's just fine for Australian iron ore producers. They still pay the price for the iron ore. And then look, even in what they call the three news, that's lithium batteries, EV vehicles and renewable energy infrastructure. The EVs and the batteries, they're full of lithium, right? Which again has become a new boom export for Australia. It just took off last year. And then you've got in the new wave of Chinese growth, lithium's being boosted a lot, Australian lithium. So that 5% growth target, you'll hear a lot of the international community saying that's a low target for China, and they'll be underwhelmed by what happens there. And they won't be wrong for their own economies, but Australia is a complete oddity in its relationship with China, and our economy will still make a huge amount of money from even this kind of slower, more statist Chinese economy.
One of the things Will has been missing is the noodles from the neighbourhood where he used to live.
In my old neighbourhood, there's a gorgeous roast duck place, and it's just catch up with some friends, get some Tsingtao beer, and you can't go wrong. Not far from there, actually, there's two of my favourite noodle places in the city. One makes a kind of Wuhan hot and sour noodles. They're just amazing. And then there's another one that's got it's a sort of spicier noodle from Shanxi, Xi'an noodles. And you can get them in Sydney, actually, as well. But yeah, this place in Beijing's worth a trip. It's unreal, and it costs, I don't know, a couple of dollars. It's, a good meal.
Will Glasgow is the Australian's China correspondent. Thanks for joining us on The Front. You can check out all Will's reporting by subscribing at theaustralian.com.au.